She is a full professor of public administration at the Department of Politics and Public Administration at the University of Konstanz. She have previously held the research and visiting positions at University of Bern, Mannheim, Heidelberg, Exeter, and the European University Institute in Florence. She holds a master's degree in political science at the University of Zurich and a PhD in public administration from the University of Bern. Eva, really nice to meet you, and I really appreciate your time you are sharing with us. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ulises. Hello, everyone. Hola, Mexico. Thank you for the great honor of having this opportunity to present my research here at FLACSO. Let me just try and I think I need to switch. Hold on. Okay. Sorry, just a second. Here we go. Do you see my my screen? All right. Can you nod, Ulises, if you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Wonderful. So today I'm going to talk about my research developing the theoretical Hexagon model to explain the occurrence of public sector corruption. And this is work co-authored with Juliana Ioannidis, Tiziano Zgaga, and Frederic Schwarz from the University of Konstanz, which is a tiny town in southern Germany, just right at the border with Switzerland. This research has been published in the journal Governance last year. So the reason why this paper was written, because about roughly 4 years ago, I started to be interested in researching corruption. That was because, you know, of the pandemic, and here in Europe, we had all these big corruption scandals related to procurement of face masks, which as you may remember, at the beginning of the pandemic, were at very short supply. And so I started to delve into corruption literature, and I quickly got really overwhelmed. I don't know, I mean, I think most of you are master students, so you probably know this feeling, right? So you start researching about a topic and you realize there is so much out there. And in the case of corruption, this is really a thing. Corruption is being researched in all these different disciplines: political science, public administration, sociology, criminology, psychology, economy, and so on. And so I just didn't really know where to start. And so I decided, look, we need to start by really comprehensively reviewing this literature and trying to connect the dots between them. And as I realized that there are so many different approaches to explaining corruption, which, however, don't really speak to each other, the goal became not just reviewing the literature, but actually developing a comprehensive model to explain public service sector corruption that kind of integrates these different insights from different disciplines, and also the different levels of analysis at which they operate, you know, from the cross-national comparative level to the individual level of predispositions to corruption. At the same time, we wanted to develop a model that really recognizes how context-specific corruption is, so that it can look very different in different contexts, and also how complex this phenomenon is in terms of that it just can have so many different explanations. And the result is this corruption hexagon framework, which is one of the few works of mine that are more of a theoretical, conceptual, rather than purely empirical nature. But that doesn't mean that we're not actually testing this model. So we're also applying it to the context of corruption risks in public procurement in the European Union. So what do I mean when I say public sector corruption? I'd like to cite here the recent definition by Phillips et al. in Perspectives on Politics, which, by the way, is a really great article that I recommend everyone to read, which defines corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain that harms the public interest, typically breaches either laws, regulations, or integrity standards. So what does it mean? Public sector corruption has these 4 definitional elements. So there is a public actor, not a private one, who has some power for their public office. It could be a politician, but it could also be a bureaucrat. That it could be a police officer, but it could be a minister, which they somehow abuse. So they use it in a way that's beyond the competences that they're assigned in order to have some direct private gain, which could be material. So it could be money, for instance. It could be a position, for instance. It could also be sexual favors. So there's also something called sexual corruption. And in so doing, it somehow harms the public interest. So the abuse is not just for private gain, but there is also a harm to the public interest. And that's when we see corruption. So corruption is, I'm not looking at corruption committed by private actors, but really by actors holding a public office. And not everything that's sort of fishy is corruption. So for example, favoritism isn't always corruption if there's no direct private gain for the person who abuses their power. Now, corruption is a phenomenon that has many different faces. So we have one label, we've got a million of phenomena, which can range, let's say, from this petty individual corruption where, individual, often low-level public servants abuse their authority to get some small sum of money. I mean, I remember when I was traveling, actually Mexico, a long time ago, very long time ago. At some point, I was traveling with an elderly Canadian lady in a Volkswagen bus, in a camper van, and at some point we were stopped by a police officer who claimed that we had violated some traffic rule, which wasn't true. And once we gave this officer a bit of money, he let us go. So that's an example of petty corruption, right? But there can also be grand corruption, which involves major political or executive actors and often involves really huge sums of money and the abuse of a high-level public office. So those face mask scandals that I mentioned earlier, they were often of this kind. So there was, for example, a minister that would use private connections to get them a procurement contract for face masks, often many millions of masks, which would, involve millions of public money that were spent on these masks. And then there is also systemic or institutional corruption, which is when corruption kind of becomes an informal institution that through which people can access some aspect of governance or a public service, which often works in the absence of very well-functioning formal institutions. And so a lot of different phenomena subsumed under public sector corruption. And accordingly, we also see many different theoretical approaches to explain why corruption happens. And we can broadly group them into 5 theoretical approaches. There's a rational choice approach, which argues that, rational actors who are aware of their strategic interests and of their opportunities will maximize their utility based on a cost-benefit analysis. And there's often a principal-agent relationship where, for example, an actor, was delegated a public task. And so under this model, basically, if actors have the opportunity and they have the motivation, then they will engage in corruption because it's rational for them, because they have a gain out of it. This is often studied at the micro level, but the assumptions operate at the micro level of the individual, but it's often studied at the aggregate macro level, maybe even comparing different countries with each other, which we find, for example, in economists really like rational choice approaches, but also public choice or comparative politics approaches. But then there is also a more sociological approach to it, which we also see in public law, public policy, and public administration, which looks at corruption more from a structural perspective, so that there, for example, there are cultures, specific cultures or specific institutional contexts that create a social structure in which actors are embedded, and the agency of the individual actors is kind of influenced by this structure. So, for example, in cultures that kind of normalize corruption as something that people do in order to interact with each other, people will do it because they perceive it as normal and acceptable. This perspective usually looks at structures at the macro or meso level, so it could be at the level of nations, of societies, but it could also be at the level of organizations, looking at organizational practices and organizational cultures. And then there is a third approach, which makes yet a different argument, which says, well, you know, corruption is always a transaction. So there are at least two actors, and there is a relationship between them. That we need to understand this relationship, because this exchange is usually based on some level of trust, and there is often an unequal power relation. So someone kind of holds a public office and tells the other one, you can only access this service if you pay me, for instance, right? So it's also about accountability and all these things. This is the kind of relationship, so, the kind of perspective where we, for example, look at networks, we look at supply, questions of supply, we look at, for example, how organized crime operates, and you know, builds networks with politicians and things like that. We find this, for example, in anthropology studies, in psychology studies, and also in political sociology literature. This is more at the micro or meso level. And then there is yet a different theoretical approach to explaining corruption, which we would call the bad apple approach, which basically says corruption is the result of the bad character of exceptional individuals who lack integrity, who lack ethicality, for instance, right? And so that's the approach we find in criminology, to try to understand why people have criminal predispositions. We also find it in some strands of public administration that, for example, look at ethical leadership and things like this. We find it in psychology. But it usually operates then at the micro level, right? It looks at specific individuals or cases of corruption. And then there is basically another approach, which is not really a theory, because there is usually no theory behind it. It just looks at correlations. Just says, makes like a list of variables that is say federalism and the rule of law and so on will influence corruption, and then it analyzes the correlations. We find that quite often in economics, but also sometimes in political science. So I don't know how you see this, but I think this all makes sense. It's kind of, there's something to all of this, right? So basically, yes, all these are valid perspectives to look at corruption. But these different literatures, they operate kind of in silos, in isolation, and each of them assumes that their explanation is the better one. Now, what I was thinking was, wouldn't it be nice if we could have a framework that combines these perspectives and allows for different theoretical explanations to work together? And that's kind of the ambition that we have here, right? So we see that there are problems in the corruption literature. It's so vast, but it's also fragmented, with different models operating in isolation and not really speaking to each other. And the concepts that this literature uses are often not very precise, and it's not clear how they apply to different environments, cultural or institutional environments. And each of the explanations is kind of partial and also often static, so it doesn't usually account for how things evolve over time, for instance. So as a result of this, we often end up with a very long list of variables that could matter, right? But we don't really know how these variables work together in complex manner, in complex ways, what the underlying process is, what the role of time is, whether we have causal chains, and so on. And another thing that I observed is that the literature often neglects how the macro level context influences lower level corruption events, and also kind of the supply for corruption. So the fact that in some context, there are actors that very actively pursue corruption because it helps, for example, their business model. Let's see. So what we're trying to do with our model is we try to integrate these different aspects. And it's a big ambition, so we might fail. I look forward to your critique. On the one hand, we argue that we need to account for context. And of course, everyone agrees, right? Yeah, of course, context matters, but how does it matter? And what is context? When is something context, actually? And the literature is often very silent about this, but we would adopt the definition by Felitti and Lynch, which says context is analytically relevant, but it's also not directly causally relevant. So it's basically the background that sets the stage for how the different causal mechanisms that lead to corruption unfolds. But it does not directly constitute an actual explanation for corruption. So let's say if a cultural context views it as kind of acceptable to give presents in favor of, in exchange for favors, right? Which is just something that in some cultures it's just very like established that you do this. Then this might affect how people perceive corruption. It might not cause them to engage in corruption, but it changes the meaning of the phenomenon that they see. I remember when I was a lecturer I was in the UK for a while, and we had a master program. We had a lot of students coming from some Asian contexts, where exactly what I just described is really the norm. And usually, what frequently happened is in this period after they submitted their seminar paper or their thesis to me, but before I returned my grading to them, they would come to my office, knock on my door, and come with a small gift, right? Something like maybe a bit of chocolate. And they would express their gratitude for the wonderful course that I had and so on. And for them, this was just something, it was totally clear, this is the appropriate thing you do. It's a matter of respect and friendliness toward your lecturer. But for me, coming from this totally different cultural context, it was just like this. It's too much for me. I cannot accept this, you know? I mean, I haven't given you my grade yet. Come back when I gave you my grade. And I ended up in the end just putting a sign on my door saying, I will never, under any circumstances, accept any gifts from students. I know you mean well, but just don't even try, right? And so it's not about right or wrong. It's just different ways of looking at things. It's culture, right? It changes the meaning. Context can also act as a barrier, so some things are not possible in some contexts, but they may be possible in others. So we need to account for context more systematically in corruption studies. And another argument of ours is that we need to distinguish the circumstances of corruption. So basically the causally relevant circumstances, for example, in an organization or in a specific situation, in a crisis, for instance, from the personal characteristics of those holders of public office that commit or potentially commit the corrupt act. So the circumstances are really the setting in which public officials engage in corruption that includes the opportunity and the supply for corruption. And unlike context, these situational features directly contribute to corruption. The circumstances kind of enable and incentivize corruption. They are not sufficient on their own. They need to combine with characteristics of a specific person who then has the characteristics that trigger them to engage in corrupt behavior. And so this is, based on this, we developed this hexagon model that combines these different literatures and different theoretical arguments into one theoretical model that distinguishes 6 different sets of factors that contribute to corruption in combination with each other. So we can distinguish in the upper half of the figure the circumstances and on the lower half, the personal characteristics. So we have the macro level context, that's kind of the structural argument, right? Institution, culture, that is conducive to corruption. And then if we go on the left-hand side, we've got specific opportunities for corruption. For example, more or less stringent accountability structures that might create opportunities, you know, weaknesses in the system that, if exploited, make it possible for corruption to occur. But then we also have, different from just opportunity, active supply of corruption, which is when we have actions or actor constellations that actively encourage or pursue corrupt exchanges. For example, the mafia or some other form of organized crime. But it can also be, for example, we know that some companies, when they expand to, you know, the global south, they actually specifically hire people, give them a lot of money, so they go loaded with gifts to talk to the politicians of those countries and make them favorable for the company. We know that it happens. This is also a supply for corruption, right? And then when we turn to the lower half, to the personal characteristics, on the left-hand side, we've got the capability of actors to engage in corruption. So the opportunity, sorry, just to go back for a second, because I forgot to say, the opportunity, that's kind of the rational choice, sort of the part of the rational choice argument, right? Whereas the supply, that's the relational approach to corruption. And then the capability, that's kind of the other half of the rational choice argument. It also has to do with this bad apple approach. So there's a personal traits and abilities that make an individual prone to engaging in corruption. So for example, low ethical values, or you've got to be a good liar. You've got to be very resistant to stress because you're going to have to handle difficult situations and keep up the face of it, right? But personal characteristics also include not just the capability, but then also actively the motivation to engage in corruption. So that's the individual need or desire to commit corruption. Sometimes that's a desire. It could be financial incentives, right? But sometimes it's because you're pressured into it. You might really, you know, kind of be no way out in a situation than to do this. For example, because your boss kind of pushes you to do something that you wouldn't otherwise do, or maybe a colleague does it, right? And that again goes a bit in this psychological bad apple argument, and it can also relate to the rational choice argument. Finally, and that's where the criminology literature is really strong in showing that this all is not enough, because for actors to commit corruption, they usually rationalize the act of corruption. So there's a cognitive effort to reduce the dissonance, because you know it's not something you should do. Corruption isn't always illegal. Sometimes it's a loophole, for instance. But you always know somehow this is not right. You're overstepping the boundaries. And so actors normalize it for themselves. This, oh, all the others do it too. Or it's not that bad. You know, it's just a one-off thing, right? And so this is our attempt to combine these theoretical arguments into one overarching framework. Now, of course, which specific constellation results in corruption, it will depend on the context. And also how supply, capability, rationalization, and so on look like exactly empirically depends on your research setting, right? This is like more like an overarching heuristic. And I'm going to show you now how this could be operationalized. This is just one example, but there could be others. So the cool thing about this framework is that it's incredibly flexible, right? So it can really be adapted and operationalized in a specific research setting. Another cool thing about this framework is that it allows us to distinguish passive versus active factors. So the passive factors are the ones that basically create possibilities that shape how corruption can occur. So the context, the circumstances, and the capacities. Whereas the active factors describe how actively corruption is actually sought after. So, for example, givers and receivers really need to take action to actually make a transaction happen in terms of supply, pressure, motivation, rationalization. So it's about the pursuing corruption. So if the upper half is the circumstances and the lower half is the personal characteristics, what we see here is that kind of the lower right part is the active factors, and the upper left part is the passive factors. And so we can have more passive or more active pathways toward corruption. So we're basically, based on this framework, we can account for some aspects of complexity in corruption. So we can theorize how these different factors work together. For example, we argue that on the one hand, circumstances must be conducive to corruption for corruption to occur. And of course, we're not the first to say this, but the literature usually said, well, opportunities. So it's just actors need to have the opportunity, and then they also have the capacity, and then corruption happens. We argue that the circumstances could be either the opportunities, but it could also be, even in the absence of, systemic opportunities, there could be an active supply for corruption. So it could be either or, right? So that we have to see either opportunities or supply for corruption to occur. So that's kind of a necessary condition, right? So that's why we use this backward arrow for necessary. A second expectation, again, quite general. I hope you still hear me. Do you? Yeah? Okay. Is that the circumstances must combine then with personal characteristics or with rationalization to trigger corruption. But again, how exactly this combination looks like depends on the context. So we would say either opportunities or supply together with, that's this asterisk, either capability or motivation or rationalization, maybe even combinations thereof, and then we see corruption. These are very general theoretical arguments, but also arguments that we can test empirically, right? And that's what we do subsequently. Regarding the role of context, we don't have a clear expectation other that these constellations are context specific, and context can act as a barrier, or it can change the meaning of these corrupt interactions. Okay, so how do we test this empirically? There's a tendency, there is generally often a Western bias in literature. When it comes to the corruption literature, the way that this bias manifests is that Western scholars study context of weak state institutions from afar, kind of with the underlying assumption that corruption is a problem of the others and not of ourselves, right? But actually, there is research showing that corruption also prevails in context of comparatively strong state institutions and strong economic wealth, like, let's say, Europe. So for example, we had a host of these face mask scandals during the pandemic. There was a lot of corruption going on. And we also know, also from the pandemic, actually, that it varies a lot between countries. I will show you that in a second. So there's a lot of variation to explain, even in these different contexts, right? And so we argue that the Europe during the pandemic is actually a relevant context for just testing the explanatory power of the hexagon. The pandemics generally, so crises generally tend to actually trigger corruption. Crises create the kind of uncertainty and also the kind of chaos, basically, that enables actors to sort of do corrupt things without it getting noticed, because most people are busy with other things, right? During the pandemic, the way this manifested was, for instance, that the rules for public procurement for these face masks were relaxed, right? So that the governments could buy face masks quickly. And without these institutional safeguards for procurement, there were a lot of opportunities for corruption. And we know that public procurement is when governments buy services. They usually buy services from businesses, from private businesses, right? So let's say face masks, but it could also be water supply or construction of roads, you know, security services in prisons, things like that. And so because a really big chunk of taxpayers' money is spent in public procurement. So this is where public money meets the private sector, right? And so this is where we've got the demand and the supply for corruption. So a lot of the corruption actually happens in procurement. So again, it's a critical case to demonstrate the explanatory power of the Hexagon framework. So the outcome or the dependent variable that we want to explain is the corruption risks in public procurement in the year 2020 in Europe. I will show you that we use data from the Government Transparency Institute, which is basically a ready-made database that anyone can access. You can access it. I think the data is not only on Europe, actually, which looks at, so it's a database of public procurement contracts that were granted by governments. So for example, in the EU, every government has to report, make transparent publicly all the procurement contracts that it has issued. And it looks at different characteristics of these contracts, whether they grant leeway or ambiguity in legal rules, procedures, institutional arrangements that are commonly associated with corruption, that are red flags for corruption. I will get back to this in a second. And in so doing, we triangulate many different databases. So we only use secondary data. We did not collect data ourselves, which from these countries, which we then aggregated and normalized. So we used the mean values from 2018 to 2020 in 23 countries. So why are we looking at corruption risks? And for this, I need to take a quick step back and talk about how can we actually research corruption. What kind of data do we have to study corruption? I think that's a relevant question. Now, it would be really nice if we could just, as you see here in the upper right corner, if we could just sort of observe the transaction, right? Ah, money was given. Ah, gotcha. That's not how it works. Corruption is an illicit behavior and it's typically hidden. So it's very difficult to obtain reliable data on corruption. It's also a sensitive behavior, so actors are not just going to admit it. So there's this social desirability bias. People don't want to admit that they did this, right? And why should they if we cannot show it? So 95% of corruption research is not about corruption. It does not empirically look at corruption. It might look at corruption risks, which are basically structural, institutional, or for example, contract level factors that sort of create risks for corruption, so in the sense of opportunities for corruption. Administrative outputs, things administrations do that we know make it more likely that corruption occurs, but they doesn't mean that corruption really happens. We haven't observed corruption. So the big advantage of this kind of data is that it usually it's unbiased. So it's not about perceptions or it's something people report, but it's a structural feature, institutional feature, organizational feature that we can just measure. But it's also that's the downside, it's indirect. So it's got a lower content validity because it doesn't measure what it should measure directly. A second approach is to instead study the perceptions of corruption. So we could, for example, do a survey of the general population. Some of you have probably bumped into this Transparency International ranking of countries, of different levels of corruption in countries, right? Let me tell you, these are just perceptions of experts. And the problem with these perception indices, whether they are general, just asking, oh, how corrupt are people in country X, or whether they're more sector specific, so maybe you ask specific public administrations or you ask businesses about it in a specific sector, like say public health, they're potentially biased. They might just reflect stereotypes that people have about a country. The good thing is they're a bit more direct. And then the third approach, which I would argue would be the gold standard, is to observe actual corruption. So we know corruption actually happened. The problem is, for this, it had to be uncovered. So, for example, there had to be a whistleblower. There had to be journalists uncovering it through an undercover, investigation. It could be that courts. So courts made a ruling after they checked all the evidence and sent the police to search different offices, computers, and so on. So we could look at enforcement data. So we could look at, convicted cases of corruption. But the problem there is we will miss out on the vast majority of the corruption cases that simply went unnoticed, right? So we only measure really the tip of the iceberg. But it's got better quality of evidence and it's more direct. So, yeah. Basically, we only have imperfect options, right? And what we do here is we use the corruption risks indicators. But what's important here is that these indicators, they indicate risk for corruption, not actual corruption happening. And what you see here is the corruption risks in public procurement, the average of 2020 in 23 countries of Europe. And so you can just focus on the black bars here, which is kind of all products, not just health products. And what we see here is that, for example, well, where is Germany? It's here. Germany had much higher corruption risks than Finland. Austria, even higher. So there are really big differences between these European countries in the corruption risks index. And it's these differences that we are trying to explain using the Hexagon framework. So what are these corruption risks? So again, the corruption risks, it's based on the idea that where there is smoke, there's also fire. So if we have institutional factors or contract level factors that we know facilitate corruption, then probably corruption also occurs more frequently. When we look at public procurement, it could be that there's a contract. So there is a tender, so the government issued a call for tenders, so people can apply, for example, for constructing a road, but we see there was only one bid. So only one business actually applied for it. That makes it more likely that corruption occurs. Or that the government avoids publishing the call for tender, so it can just give it to its preferred bidder. Or, for example, that tender is by invitation rather than open tender, where the call for tenders is published. So this indicates that competition is deliberate. The number of days that the tender was advertised is maybe too short, so that nobody really realistically has the chance to apply for it except for that favorite bidder who was actually already informed in advance. Or the evaluation criteria for the tender that are outlined in the call for tenders are very hard to quantify. They're very subjective. So that basically the criteria can be bended in favor of the preferred bidder, right? So that there is discretion and limited accountability for outsiders to check whether this was really the best offer. So it can also be that the time used to decide on the submitted bids is really short, so indicating they didn't really check, they already knew who they want, or it's like really low. So snap decisions, short decisions may reflect that it was already clear, while long decisions may suggest that there was a challenge, a legal challenge, there might have been an outright violation of law. So that's the kind of stuff that this corruption risk indicator by Fajekas and Kocic, which we use, which is publicly available, measures. Now, now we know how we measure the outcome. Now the question is, how do we operationalize this hexagon frame? So we've got these 6 corners, right? And now what? What is supply? What is opportunity? Now, the way this normally works is that we're going to start with a review of the literature. So we end up with a list of variables or factors or mechanisms that we think would be relevant. And then for each of these variables, we can sort of undergo this decision tree, and we can ask, well, is this a personal characteristics of a public official? Yes or no? If not, it relates to circumstances, right? And then we can ask, is it about the individual need or desire to commit corruption? If yes, it's pressure motivation. If not, we can go on and so on. So basically, we can go through this decision tree, and like this, we can attribute the factor to a hexagon corner. And if it's none of it, then it's probably the context, or it's irrelevant. But so that allows us to start out with a literature review. Literature usually talks about specific factors, and then attribute it to the hexagon framework. So what we did in our comparison of these EU countries is that we focused on the factors that are listed here on the right, in the right-hand column. And I just want to stress that this is not the one right way to operationalize the hexagon. It's just one possible way. So the researcher always had to argue why this is the valid way of, measuring, let's say, supply or rationalization in a given context. So in terms of context, we look at levels of gender equality, because research shows that in more patriarchal societies, actually, people perceive corruption as more acceptable, interestingly. We look at the stability of the political system, because instability facilitates corruption. And we look at levels of economic wealth, because it is often argued, especially in economic literature, that poorer countries are more prone to corruption. Then at the level of opportunity, we look at press independence. So a more independent press is known to be more, to act as an accountability actor, and so to act, to basically exercise scrutiny on public office holders, which prevents them from, engaging in corruption without it being detected. We look at levels of public sector transparency. The more transparent the public sector is, the more difficult it is to hide corruption for public office holders. We look at rule of law levels. The rule of law is also about, having institutional safeguards to prevent corruption. And related to this, we look at specifically at public sector accountability. To operationalize the supply, we look at levels of organized crime. So there are some regions of Europe where we have really high levels of organized crime, for example, in Italy, also in some areas of Central and Eastern Europe, for instance. At the level of capability, we look at levels of public integrity. And when it comes to pressure motivation, we measure the mean salaries of people working in the public sector, where the assumption is that lower salaries create a need or a motivation to generate a side income. And when it comes to rationalization, based on the literature, we look at the interplay of 2 factors of interpersonal trust, so the extent to which people trust each other in society. Higher level of interpersonal trust tend to come with more corruption. And we also look at trust in government, where actually a lower level of trust in government helps people to rationalize corruption. So to basically say, well, they probably all do it, they're all corrupt, right? So this is how we operationalize the hexagon. And then we use different secondary databases to get empirical data on this, again, aggregated over these 3 years from 2018 to 2020, and they're coming from different sources. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but if you like, feel free to ask questions afterwards if you want to, right? Just to reiterate, so the data for the outcome for the above average corruption risks we take them from the Government Transparency Institute, which is publicly available. So you could click on this link and you will get there. So important here is that each of the variables basically expresses whether or not this factor is above or below average in this country. So, for example, we compare, we explain why a country has above average corruption risks, which could be because it's above average capability, for instance, or it's above average motivation. So, in terms of the method, we use fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis. And I know that you people are particularly interested in methods. And so I'm going to try and spend a few minutes to explain how this method works. So my philosophy to research is that there's not one method that's better than others. We should choose the method that's best suited to study a given research question. So there's got to be a good fit between our theoretical expectations and what an empirical research method allows us to model. And we have seen earlier that the corruption hexagon specifically assumes complexity, right? There are different factors you have to combine, but they could combine in different ways. And also that these configurations might be context dependent. And that's exactly what qualitative comparative analysis allows us to model. Qualitative comparative analysis allows us to study conditions, complex conditions, so it could be combinations of conditions that are either necessary or sufficient for an outcome. So necessary means they have to be there for the outcome to occur. Remember, we argued earlier that the circumstances have to be conducive to corruption for corruption to occur, right? But it's not enough, so that's just necessary. It's only sufficient if the circumstances combine with personal characteristics of the involved public office holders. So sufficient means that if they combine with that, they will typically lead to corruption. So that's a bit different from more probabilistic arguments, where we talk about, factors increasing or decreasing the likelihood of something happens. That's not what QCA is able to do. So, and it doesn't mean that we cannot also use the hexagon framework under a more probabilistic approach. But here what we do is we look at these more deterministic patterns in the data. So QCA is a set theoretic method, which basically means, as I said, that we analyze above or below average levels of these different factors. And we then build a truth table. The truth table basically lists all the different logically possible combinations of these different factors, which is always 2 to the power of the number of conditions. So, So basically, what we see here is a truth table. We have these 6 conditions, right? The context, opportunity, supply, capability, motivation, and rationalization. So let's just look until then. Let's not look further yet. And each of them can be present or absent. So a 1 means it's above average. So it could be to different degrees above average, which we capture with our data. It's not shown here, but it's in the data. Whereas 0 means it's below average, right? So for example, here we have the context is more conducive than not. Opportunities for corruption are above average. Supply is below average. Capability is above average. Motivation and rationalization is also below average. And then what we see over here is which cases display this specific combination. So for example, here this is Cyprus. Here we have 3 cases, Bulgaria, Greece, and Italy, that display the presence of all the 6 hexagon factors. And then what we can do is we can calculate how consistently, that's the inclusion here, how consistently these cases also display corruption, above average corruption risks. And if the consistency is high enough, we will say that this combination typically results in corruption. And we will put a 1 for the outcome, for the output here. For example, all the rows that are marked green here, they are sufficient for corruption, for above average corruption risks, I have to say. And the others are not. But we also see that in these green rows, there are a few cases, these are the ones that are marked bold, that actually have below average corruption risks. So that's Greece and Slovakia. These are kind of what we would call the deviant cases, which later we have to explain separately why they do not correspond to this pattern. But there's basically also a bit of a probabilistic element here, in that it's not a perfect sufficiency pattern, but it's a good enough sufficiency pattern. So basically, we've got these green constellations of conditions here that are sufficient for corruption. And now we want to sort of get a shorter expression. So we want to boil it down to the combinations of factors that trigger corruption, above average corruption risks. And the way this works is that we do what's called logical minimization. So the principle of logical minimization is that we perform paired comparisons of truth table rows that are identical, except for one factor, one's being absent and one's being present. So for example, if we compare here the row number 53 with row number 55, we can see they're identical, except that here motivation is below average and here it is above average, right? Otherwise, they have the exact same configuration. And so during these paired comparisons, software says, okay, we consistently observe above average corruption risks here and also here. So it doesn't matter whether motivation is above or below average. We can just minimize it away. This factor is redundant, and we get a shorter expression, which means that if the context is conducive to corruption, opportunities are above average, but there is a below average supply, above average capability, and below average rationalization, then we see corruption, above average corruption risk. And so we do this so the software keeps comparing these different expressions, keeps minimizing away more conditions until no further minimization is possible. And that's how we get to the solution of the QCA. That's the underlying principle. And thankfully, the software does it for us. All right. So now, after 1 hour, I can finally get to my results. So first, we performed an analysis of necessity. So we analyzed whether there are constellations of factors that are needed for corruption risks to be above average. And that was kind of our first expectation, was that the context must be conducive for corruption to occur. And indeed, we find evidence for this. So the data support this assertion. So for corruption risks to be above average, there must be either above average opportunity or above average supply for corruption, which means that we need to see the circumstances conducive to corruption, but supply also matters and could actually substitute for opportunities to enable corruption. And we see that most cases are consistent with this. So if they have either opportunity or supply, they also so basically if they have above average corruption risks, they also have either opportunity or supply. So these are the cases up here. There is one exception which has above average corruption risks, but actually neither opportunity nor supply, and that's Estonia. So this is kind of again, it's a deviant case, right? And this is an interesting case because neither its circumstances nor the aggregated actor characteristics are prone to corruption, but its context is conducive to corruption, and also rationalization is above average. But what's interesting is it has an above average corruption risk at institutional level. In this Transparency International ranking of corruption perceptions, it consistently ranks among the least perceived corrupt countries of the world. So the institutional data are in stark contrast to the perception data. It's really interesting. We're not sure why, but we can see that it's kind of an idiosyncratic case. It's different than the others in this sense. And what we do know is that it has very high levels of public sector digitalization and transparency. So it's a pioneer worldwide in public sector digitalization, which also facilitates a more effective detection of corruption practices. So this high visibility of problems in procurement could increase the measured corruption risks. So while these, new digital systems, for example, e-procurement, increase transparency, they also open new opportunities for these tech-savvy actors to exploit loopholes in the system. So we have new corruption opportunities. So overall, future research should tackle this case to understand, what its implications are for the interpretation and validity of corruption risks in countries that have really these modernized administrative structures. But it is just one deviation, and otherwise all the cases actually are in line with this first expectation of ours. So we need circumstances enabling corruption, but it's not enough. And we then analyze the sufficient conditions for above average corruption risks. And we also find support for these expectations. We find that there are 4 kind of pathways or configurations that result in above average corruption risk. So we can see here on the left-hand side, different constellations, and then on the right-hand side, the cases, the countries that display these characteristics. What we see in the first path is what we would call the high-risk corruption cases, because they display 5 out of the 6 hexagon factors. So the context is conducive to corruption, opportunities for corruption exist, supply exists, actors have the capability for corruption, and they also have the motivation for corruption. And then rationalization doesn't really matter. We see above average corruption risks. We see this, for example, in Italy and in Bulgaria. In Italy, we have comparatively low salaries of public sector employees. And we also see organized crimes, that's a supply. Opportunities for corruption increased when procuring pandemic-related products started to happen, and it spilled over to other procurement areas. And Italy already had before low levels of integrity in public procurement and declining levels of accountability and transparency. So what we also see here is that Greece also has this constellation, but it had below average corruption risk, but only just slightly below average. So it almost was a case of average or above average. And therefore we argue that it doesn't really contradict this pattern. It's just kind of a victim of how we, aggregate the data. In the second path here, we have an absence of opportunities for corruption, and at the same time, supply for corruption and also rationalization of corruption. And we see this pathway prevails in a lot of countries, 5 countries with above average corruption risk, and then 1 country, Slovakia, with below average corruption risk. So it's quite a frequent pathway. So rationalization in these countries either happened because of strong interpersonal trust, like in Ireland or Spain, or because of weak trust in government, like in France, Croatia, and Romania. So for example, in Spain, there are scarce opportunities for corruption, except for public sector accountability and freedom of press. However, levels of organized crime, such as supply, are among Europe's highest, and these organized actor structures pursue corrupt exchanges in public procurement within social relations that are characterized by trust. So people trust each other more than the government. And corruption risks here in Spain increased sharply during the early COVID-19 pandemic. But this did not happen in Slovakia, where corruption opportunities are notably lower than in the other countries. So we don't really know why Slovakia deviates, but it's just 1 out of 6 cases. And what we see here is that we have these 2 active factors, right? Supply and rationalization, that kind of trump the absence of the passive factor. So there may not be opportunities, but if there's supply and rationalization, we see corruption. Then we have a third path where the opposite is the case, where passive trumps active factors. We have opportunities, we have capabilities, and then we have low levels of rationalization. We see this in Cyprus and in Hungary. So for example, in Hungary, procurement corruption is facilitated by particularistic networks of buyers and suppliers that systematically distort procurement markets, but get disrupted every time the government changes. And then we have path 4, which is the only path which does not support this expectation of circumstances with personal characteristics. Because here we have a context that is not conducive to corruption. We also don't see rationalization, but we see strong opportunities for corruption. And this is just one country, this is Austria. And Austria is, at the time, was a really special case. You guys probably don't remember this, but this was under Chancellor Kurz, he was the youngest chancellor Austria ever had, and he exited the government with a huge scandal. So basically, the entire government ended up just being completely corrupt under Sebastian Kurz. And so we call this the political corruption path, which we kind of didn't really capture with our operationalization that much. So there was a lot of high-level corruption cases, and when the pandemic hit, Austria's generally relatively pronounced political corruption may have also spilled over into the procurement sector. But overall, these results provide support for the validity of the corruption hexagon framework. We find support for our expectations. We see that in the EU context, circumstances that are prone to corruption, not just opportunities, but also supply for corruption sometimes enable high corruption risks. And then we see that circumstances need to combine with personal characteristics or rationalization to result in above average corruption risks. And we also see that active factors may compensate for passive factors and vice versa. So this distinction between passive and active factors, which is really something novel of the hexagon frameworks, seems to work empirically, and I would really encourage more research into it, specifically this sort of pattern, which is really interesting. Our results don't really give us much insightful information about the role of context, so this is something that we need to leave for future research. To sum it up, what are some of the advantages of the hexagon framework, which I also think, for you, maybe if you think about your topic, for your thesis and so on, it integrates all these different levels of analysis and also the sending and the receiving side of corruption. At the same time, it allows a variety of disciplinary and theoretical perspectives, and it's very flexible. So you can use it to analyze levels of corruption. You can use it to analyze a specific case of corruption at the macro, meso, or micro level. You can operationalize it the way that suits your research setting best. It explicitly models the plural causal mechanisms or processes that cause corruption, so it's suitable to model complexity. And you could also combine it with mechanistic approaches like process tracing, in-depth case studies, to trace the linkages that combines these different factors, these different hexagon corners, and also accounts for the role of contextual factors. You can use it under a quantitative or a qualitative approach, but it overcomes these different disciplinary silos to better explain the occurrence of corruption in the real world. And I think thereby it really fosters theoretical progress, because it really overcomes these different silos and connects the dots between these different perspectives. So I really look forward to our discussion and to your insights. I would be interested in hearing what would you use the Hexagon framework for. So for example, I currently use it to compare different cases of face mask scanners in Europe, so qualitative research. How would you adapt the Hexagon framework to your research context? Do you have any questions about the paper, critiques, suggestions? So I look forward to your comments. Thank you for your attention. And with this, I'm done.
Thank you very much. A lot.
Should I stop my sharing or should I continue sharing? Probably better to stop, right?
Sharing.
All right.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just let me check. I'm gonna.
Yo tengo una duda, pero no sé cómo plantearla en específico.
Yeah. I can hear you.
La cuestión, ¿cómo le asignas el valor? Porque no es todo lo... No, a ver. ¿Sí? Básicamente, siento que de todas las variables que conforman el estudio, se les asigna un valor. Este valor no necesariamente igual y es un mío metodológico, pero me gustaría ahondar un poco más en cómo se le asigna el valor o el peso a una variable para que podamos eh, asignar, ¿no? Pienso en el razonamiento, en la motivación y pienso en el caso de México, por ejemplo. Eh, eh, yo creo que acá en el país hay muchas situaciones los guardias de tránsito eh, tienen tienen la motivación, tienen el salario bajo, etcétera, y es una condición que necesariamente sabría cómo que darle más peso, darle menos peso. Eh, Creo que es una cuestión básicamente cómo asignamos un valor para determinar la probabilidad de que pase la corrupción, ¿no? Y hay factores que a veces son más individuales, o todo ahora eh, una, una posibilidad. No sé si me expliqué.
Can I speak?
Go.
Okay, so thanks for your question. So I did not have the time to go into this in that detail, but here again is how we operationalize each of these variables. So we use these different secondary data sets. So for example, as you mentioned, the salaries of the bureaucrats is one of the factors that we look at, and the source here would be Eurostat, or we look at the capacity of the public sector to act in an impartial way from VDEM, and so on. And the way we then assign the values, so we have, for example, we have to set, let's take an example here. So we have the motivation set, and we use the net remuneration of center bureaucrats in real terms. For a country, we calculate the average over the years 2018, 2019, and 2020. And then we assign these values to the set above average motivation. So the sample minimum means that the country is fully out of the set, and the sample maximum means that it's fully in. And then we use the threshold for distinguishing above average from below average is just the sample average. That's how we assign the values. I hope this explains it. And we do this for each of the hexagon corners. If we have more than one indicator variable, we calculate again the average of them. We don't assign more weight to one variable than to another. We don't weigh them. But one could do that. So that if there are theoretical arguments to do it, that I think is a perfectly good thing to do.
Thank you, Eva. There's another question here.
Tengo una duda. Si bien el texto no define en sí la corrupción, entiendo que influye pues en la elección de variables. El contexto en sí podría considerar para definir el valor de cada variable. Y si no es así, podríamos decir que del contexto de cada país, pues, lo analizado, un país corrupto mientras su contexto no cambie ni influye en las variables que se toman.
Yeah, so generally I have to say that I think for me it would work better if I could just hear the person's question in Spanish. So maybe we can wait with the translation until the question has been, because I understand Spanish perfectly well. But yeah, so thanks for the question. And sorry, I forgot previously that I had no longer shared my screen, so you didn't really see it. But so basically for the, I think what you ask is how do we measure the context? So again, we had, hold on. So we had these three different factors. We had levels of gender equality because of these patriarchal systems. There's a lot of research showing that in patriarchal societies, the acceptance of corruption is higher. So that's at the level of kind of attitudes of people. The stability of the political system and levels of economic wealth. We measure the gender equality by the number of seats occupied by women in the national parliament. Again, average from 2018 to 2020 per country. And the source here is the Interparliamentary Union. Then we have a variable for the stability of government, which measures, it comes from the globaleconomy.com. It measures the likelihood of a disorderly transfer of government power, armed conflict, violent demonstrations, social unrest, international tensions, terrorism, ethnic, religious, or regional conflicts. Again, mean value 2018 to 2020. And for the economic wealth, we simply use the GDP per capita from the World Bank. So that's how we measure it. But again, in a different context, one might choose different relevant aspects. You know, so this really maybe if we study Latin American countries, there are different contexts that matter. Maybe whether, you know, who was the colonial power, for instance, because maybe they had different approaches to kind of destroying existing governance structures and setting up new, you know, administrative structures that were actually initially designed to exploit the local population. So they were basically designed for corruption, and that may have historical contingencies. Sorry, I'm deviating. But so basically what we choose as corruption depends, right? And so I think the context corner of the hexagon is special in the sense that what its role is in the explanation is really something, well, I mean, we can't theorize it ex ante, but I think it's very much an empirical question, and it's something that you have to explore. So what we argue is that it's basically important to capture this context and then look at how it works. And again, we argue that it could work in two main ways. One of them is to change the meaning of the actual causal mechanisms happening, or how people perceive different actions as corrupt or not, as illicit or not. Or it could be act as a barrier so that certain forms of corruption, for example, can't happen in you know, high accountability contexts, and so on. And I think then the other question was how we can analyze the role of corruption if it doesn't, of context for corruption, if context doesn't vary. I mean, that basically taps into epistemological questions of truth conditions for causal claims and so on. But we can always, I mean, for example, if you have a case study, you typically, if you have a qualitative case, typically study one case, which then by definition doesn't vary, right? But that doesn't mean that you cannot study the role of context. You can study the process through which context operates and influences the causal mechanism within case, right? I hope I have answered the question.
Yes, thank you.
There's another one.
Lilia, si te parece, lo hago en inglés para más fácil, para no atropellarnos. Thank you, Eva. No, my question was a little bit related to the context of Mexico. So and I did like a little AI research right now. We are, I think it's the only country in Mexico, in the world that we have an anti-corruption ministry. You know, there are a bunch of offices in Argentina, in China, which is not the best example, of course, but in China, there are like some anti-corruption things. So one of the things that I was seeing, you know, the context that you made your investigation in was in countries that had the same context. And I think it's a little bit on what Raquel was saying. We would need to measure corruption of Mexico among all the other countries that have some sort of agency, anti-corruption or something, because that's a very important variable. I think it's not just the legal context, you know, because everyone knows that if you are corrupt, you're going to go to jail, you know, but if you have a ministry within, which is a ministry, you know, it reports directly into the president, how would that affect the measurement of corruption? You know, you would have to measure it among countries that have the same, maybe not the same, because again, I don't think there is any other country that has the same, but you would have to do it in order to have like a true result, you know, because if you measure apples with pears, then, you know, you can't measure apples with pears. So you have to measure pears with pears. So my question would be that. And then just another question, like, and this is just like, because I'm being curious, what do you think the impact of that? Like, do you think that there would be an impact in having a ministry? You know, like, does people sense that, I don't know, the countries can be less corrupt, or that the consequences of corruption would be greater or bigger if there's a ministry? And that would be my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great questions. So yeah, so this kind of anti-corruption ministry. So actually in Europe, there's also some countries that, for example, have maybe not about corruption, but so they also have more formalized anti-corruption institutions than others, and also to combat organized crime. So, for example, Italy also has a separate government sort of unit that is, you know, engaged in combating specifically organized crime. And so there is also big variation about this in Europe. I just wanted to say it, but of course, there's even bigger variation now if we would go to, for example, Mexico, which is the case you mentioned. I think, so on the one hand, what I would expect such a ministry to do is to create stronger accountability structures, right? So opportunities for corruption would be fewer, in the sense there is a more enforcement of anti-corruption. So that's kind of the opportunity. That's the opportunity corner of the hexagon. So that's how we would measure it. It would not be part of the measurement of corruption per se, but it would be one factor that explains whether or not corruption can occur, right? But then again, I think it depends on the level of. So remember, we talked about how corruption can occur at all these different levels. And I don't know, I mean, I really don't know the details of this specific ministry and so on, but it might have a more direct grip on people, maybe at some level, maybe within the national government, than, you know, maybe on each single street level bureaucrats. You know, your colleague mentioned police officers and so on, operating in all the many different corners of the country, some of which are controlled by gangs more than by the government and so on, right? So it might have a stronger effect on corruption and on high-level corruption than it might have on petty corruption. For instance, it could be, right? So that's also something we would need to look at. Now, another way how I think it could affect maybe not the occurrence of corruption as such, but our data that we have on its occurrence, is that maybe such a ministry has people who collect data. I don't know, you know. So maybe they have a database of corruption cases that other countries don't have because they don't have such a ministry. So it would create new for us as researchers, different kind of data, some new possibilities to see and observe corruption. And then there might be even other ways how such a ministry changes everything that I'm not even aware of. And so I think that's how I see also the impact of the ministry. So one thing, you know, I think in the, I remember I mentioned earlier that we have a database about organized crime in Europe, and they have this organized crime index that actually distinguishes two dimensions, and I think we can do the same for corruption. One dimension is the prevalence of it, how often does it occur, and the other one is the resilience of the country against it. And resilience has to do with what rules are there and also what institutions are there to combat the phenomenon, like such a ministry, right? Or like this agency combating organized crime in Italy. And for example, some countries, for example, Germany, the country that I live in, fares very low on resilience because it has almost no laws, it has no institutions even checking whether corruption occurs. Because the assumption is, of course, nobody is corrupt in Germany, but we know that that's not true. Germany, when it comes to the face mask scandals, it had the most scandals of entire Europe. And we know that the corruption risk index has increased sharply in Germany. It has increased even more than in Italy during the pandemic. I published an article on that. But it doesn't really have institutions or rules, specifically to combat that, because historically the assumption was our public servants are super integral. And then that obviously might influence whether we know about the prevalence, because again, data might not even be collected, right? I hope I somehow, I mean, I don't have the definite answer for your question, but I hope I gave some useful inputs. If not, feel free to follow up.
Thank you. There's another one.
Hola, buenas tardes, doctora. Muchas gracias por su plática. Bueno, primero, antes de la pregunta, quisiera darle un poco de contexto. Aquí en México tenemos un sistema nacional anticorrupción que tiene una legislación muy robusta. Hay muchas leyes sobre cómo, por así decirlo, evitar la corrupción, pero la percepción aquí en México es que la corrupción sigue siendo alta, ¿no? Puede que sea paradójico porque la legislación es muy robusta, pero aún así no parecen haber resultados. Y desde mi perspectiva, el problema es que tenemos la percepción de que más es mejor y no siempre es así. Creo que a veces hay tantas leyes que ya no es tan claro cómo debe actuarse o como que está muy saturado de leyes hasta el punto en el que ya no es posible como combatir la corrupción. Entonces, en ese sentido, quisiera preguntarle su opinión y también saber cómo es por allá en Europa la cuestión, si usted considera que es mejor más leyes o menos leyes. Muchas gracias.
Yeah, thank you so much. So first of all, I just wanna state some humility here. I'm not an expert on corruption in Mexico, and so I can give you my opinion, which you asked for, but I might also be wrong. Or I might not have the full picture of all the evidence that exists, right? Well, first of all, we don't know whether there is no result of this anti-corruption authority because we lack the counterfactual. It's possible that it would be even worse without it, right? I mean, presumably it has some success, I guess, probably, hopefully, right? But so that's the first thing. But then the other thing is, I mean, the obvious fact that despite the existence of this authority, we still have pervasive levels of corruption, both petty corruption, but also political corruption, right? Grand corruption. Now, why is this the case? Well, I mean, I think, and that's probably also what different in most, though not all, European countries, is that once corruption becomes very pervasive, there's a process of normalization. And I think this process of normalization, on the one hand, acts at the level of just attitudes and culture, so that it's just something that people perceive as normal. But I mentioned this in the beginning, corruption, and especially also petty corruption, for instance, acts as an informal institution. What does it mean? It means that it has the function of providing public goods in ways that are relatively reliable and create stable expectations. And that can be especially the case in contexts when the official institutions, the formal state institutions, are not working that perfectly. So, and then that's also why it persists so much, because it's actually successful in providing the goods. I mean, just to give a hypothetical example, people know that if they want this piece of paper from the local authority, they need to pay a fee, right? And they will get it faster. And even though that's unfair and illegal, it works, right? Whereas the official process doesn't work. It takes months and months, and in the end, you still don't get it. And I think we should not underestimate this. So this institutional function means that it's incredibly difficult to eradicate corruption, because it actually fulfills its purpose in predictable ways that somehow people get used to also as well, right? So and again, so I think the colleague mentioned the police officers who don't earn enough, right? So then corruption becomes a way of generating income, and then the anti-corruption ministry can do whatever it wants as long as it doesn't enhance the salaries of the public servants. It's going to persist because they cannot oversee everything. So I think this role of corruption as an informal institution, especially in like context of weak state institutions, has not been sufficiently sort of appraised. And I think it's difficult to appraise this in a way that's not normative, right? So there's this temptation to say corruption is something bad or it's something good. And it's difficult to just say corruption is working in a way, it has an institutional function that works, right? Because that's normative and problematic. But I think it's analytically important if we want to understand why it is so difficult to combat it. Now, I guess with this, I haven't really answered the question how we can combat it. But I think I've maybe given my opinion why I think it's so difficult to combat it. Is it better to have more or less laws? Laws are only as good as their implementation, right? And I think Mexico is in many ways, a very difficult context to implement laws, because of the reasons mentioned, because there's, some areas where government has limited control, as opposed to gangs, for instance. So I have to restate my humility here. I don't know the answer, other than you can make as many laws as you want, as long as you cannot enforce them on the ground, they're useless. I hope I somehow answered your question a bit. But feel free to follow up if it hasn't.
There's no more questions here, so I really thank you for your time and your effort, Eva. Please.
Thank you so much. It was a real honor. Thank you for having me. I wish I could come over in person. One day I will, I promise.
Yeah, it will be great. We will be waiting for you for your visit.
Thank you.
We stay in touch.
Okay, thanks. Bye. Have a nice day, afternoon, I think.
Yeah, good night.
I
Thank you
think
for that.